While Europe bled under religious war and fire, its echoes reached across the Atlantic. In the shadows of battlefields like Magdeburg and White Mountain, a new world was being carved, not in peace, but in the image of blood-soaked faith and imperial hunger. It began with a window and a fall. On May 23, 1618, in the royal castle of Prague, 2 Catholic imperial officials were thrown out of a third-story window by angry Protestant nobles. They fell into a pile of manure and survived. But the event would trigger a war that would consume Europe for the next 30 years, and, in time, ripple across the Atlantic. This was the defenestration of Prague, and it marked the beginning of the 30 Years' War, a conflict so vast, so destructive, and so ideologically charged that its echoes would be felt in the forests of North America as surely as in the ruined cathedrals of Europe. The roots of the war were old. For decades, the continent had been torn by religious tension. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the authority of the Catholic Church. Lutheran princes ruled in northern Germany. Calvinists spread through the Netherlands, France, and parts of Switzerland. Catholics held firm in Spain, Austria, and the Papal States. The Holy Roman Empire, a loose confederation of German states under the Catholic Habsburg dynasty, was a powder keg. Its emperor, Ferdinand II, was a staunch Catholic and a champion of the Counter-Reformation, the Church's campaign to roll back Protestant gains. The Bohemian crown, which sat within the empire, had been controlled by Protestant nobles for decades. When Ferdinand attempted to impose Catholic rule, the Bohemian estates rebelled. That defenestration wasn't just an act of protest, it was a declaration of war. At first, it was a local affair, Protestant Bohemia versus Catholic Austria, but the conflict quickly metastasized. Protestant German princes took sides. The Dutch, still fighting their long independence war against Catholic Spain, aligned with fellow Protestants. The Swedes, under the fiery leadership of Gustavus Adolphus, would later join the war, dramatically turning the tide. But the bloodshed wasn't limited to Protestants and Catholics. This was a war of empires, dynasties, and survival. Spain entered to defend its Habsburg cousins. France, a Catholic nation, sided with the Protestants to undermine its Habsburg rivals. Denmark saw an opportunity. Poland observed. Even England, though largely peripheral militarily, saw its politics and colonial ambitions shaped by the conflict. Over 3 decades, the war became a rolling apocalypse. Whole regions of Central Europe were devastated. Cities like Magdeburg were burned to the ground, their populations slaughtered. Disease followed famine. Famine followed pillaging. Estimates vary, but some regions of the German heartland lost over a third of their population. In total, nearly 8 million people would die, most not from battle, but from starvation, plague, and the collapse of civil society. But while Europe bled, its powers still looked westward, to the New World. The early 1600s were a turning point in colonization. The Spanish had long dominated the Americas, but their empire was showing signs of strain. The English, Dutch, and French were establishing beachheads in the north. And though the fighting of the 30 Years' War stayed on European soil, its consequences profoundly shaped colonial policy, because to the crowns and courts of Europe, the colonies were more than distant outposts. They were assets in a global struggle. In 1620, just 2 years into the war, a battered ship called the Mayflower landed in New England. Its passengers, English religious dissenters fleeing the wrath of church and crown, had chosen to flee a continent consumed by ideological warfare. They weren't just seeking freedom, they were escaping a world on fire. The 30 Years' War radicalized religion across Europe. Protestant sects grew more militant. Catholic orders like the Jesuits intensified their missions. This ideological heat reached the Americas. Colonization became more than economic. It became spiritual. Settlements were planted not just for trade, but for God. France, under its Catholic monarchy, backed Jesuit missions in Canada. Spain doubled down on conversion in New Mexico and Florida. England, divided between Anglican authority and radical Puritanism, allowed religious separatists to seek refuge across the ocean. The Netherlands, locked in war with Catholic Spain, used its colony of New Netherland as a bastion of Calvinist commerce and religious tolerance. The Americas became, in effect, a proxy theater in a global religious and political conflict. Even the economy was shaped by war. As armies devoured resources in Europe, kings and ministers turned increasingly to their colonies to generate wealth. Tobacco in Virginia, sugar in the Caribbean, furs in Canada, silver from Peru. Colonial extraction accelerated, not despite the war, but because of it. And with every shipload of goods came further entrenchment of European rivalries on American soil. The Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621 at the height of the war, was not just a trade outfit. It was a weapon, designed to attack Spanish and Portuguese holdings, extract wealth, and expand Dutch influence. Its privateers raided across the Caribbean. Its governors in Manhattan oversaw not just trade with the Iroquois, but a new vision of imperial competition rooted in Calvinist values and financial might. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the war dragged on. Each peace effort collapsed. New players entered. France's involvement in the 1630s prolonged the conflict, even as war weariness consumed the continent. But in the Americas, the war was an opportunity. For the English, it meant distraction. King Charles I was reluctant to invest deeply in overseas settlements while his alliances shifted. But for the Puritans, it meant freedom to build a city upon a hill, far from the royal eye. For the Dutch and French, it meant laying the groundwork of empires that would clash violently in the decades to come. By the time the war ended in 1648, with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia, Europe had been transformed. Borders were redrawn. Sovereignty was redefined. Religion was forever fractured. But the colonies, barely noticed in the treaties, had quietly grown into strategic foundations of the modern world. The war was over, but its legacy had just begun. In America, the seeds sown in those years would grow into future wars, rebellions, and revolutions. The ideas of religious freedom, state sovereignty, and imperial rivalry, all central to the 30 Years' War, would take root in the New World soil. The fire that began in Bohemia had leapt the ocean. And though the flames in Europe were extinguished, the embers in America were only beginning to glow. The cannons thundered in Bohemia, but the tremors were felt in the forests of the New World. As Europe tore itself apart in the 30 Years' War, its ambitions did not pause. In fact, war sharpened the blade of empire. The Atlantic world became a mirror and an extension of Europe's blood-soaked struggles. Colonies were no longer isolated experiments in trade and settlement. They became pieces on a global chessboard, each move shaped by religious fury, dynastic ambition, and continental alliances. The Americas, from the icy shores of Newfoundland to the jungles of Brazil, were transformed into theaters of proxy conflict, arenas where old-world rivalries spilt over in new and brutal ways. By the 1620s, 4 European powers had established major claims in the Americas: Spain, whose empire stretched from the Andes to the Gulf of Mexico; France, entrenched in Canada and seeking to expand through trade and conversion; England, whose fledgling colonies clung to the Atlantic seaboard; the Dutch Republic, newly independent, determined to challenge Spanish and Portuguese dominance at sea. Each power arrived with its own religious identity, strategic aims, and historical wounds, and the 30 Years' War magnified them all. 1. Spain, defender of the Catholic faith. For Spain, the Americas had always been an extension of divine mission. Its conquests were justified not merely by gold, but by God. Catholic monarchs cast their empire as the sword of Christendom, especially in the face of the Protestant Reformation. During the 30 Years' War, Spain's Habsburg dynasty saw itself as the last bulwark of Catholic unity. But it was stretched thin, fighting rebels in the Netherlands, aiding Austrian cousins against Protestant princes, and financing campaigns with silver mined in Peru and Mexico. To maintain its colonial grip, Spain intensified its missionary presence in the Americas, particularly in the northern frontier. Franciscan friars, Jesuits, and Dominicans were dispatched to pacify and convert indigenous populations, a spiritual arm of an overstretched empire. In Florida, New Mexico, and California, missions became tools of both faith and control. But Spain's enemies saw opportunity in its distraction. 2. The Dutch. War on water and trade. The Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, the 80 Years' War, overlapped with the 30 Years' War. Though rooted in politics, the Dutch struggle was also religious. A Calvinist republic defying a Catholic monarchy. For the Dutch, war and commerce were the same. Their West India Company, founded in 1621, was designed not just for trade, but for sabotage. With a charter to wage private war against Spain and Portugal, the company became a quasi-military corporation, seizing ships, sacking colonies, and establishing footholds in the Americas. In New Netherland, Dutch settlers established a Calvinist outpost along the Hudson River, a colony driven by profit but shaped by ideology. Religious tolerance, unlike in Europe, was permitted, partly to attract settlers, partly to avoid provoking sectarian strife. Dutch warships also struck deeper south. In 1624, they captured parts of Brazil from Portugal and harassed Spanish silver fleets in the Caribbean. These attacks weren't random. They were economic warfare, designed to choke off Spain's lifeblood from the Americas. In this way, the 30 Years' War reached into the Atlantic, not through grand battles, but through merchant ships armed with cannons and colonial skirmishes fought far from European capitals. 3. France. Catholic crusade with commercial ambition. Though France joined the Protestant side in the 30 Years' War, it remained a staunchly Catholic nation. Under Cardinal Richelieu and later Mazarin, France pursued a policy of raison d'etat, the interest of the state above all else. This pragmatism extended to its American colonies. In New France, along the St. Lawrence River, the French established a growing empire centered on fur trade and conversion. The Jesuits, elite Catholic missionaries, saw the wilderness as a spiritual battlefield. They believed they were rescuing souls from Protestant corruption and indigenous paganism alike. But they were also agents of empire. Every mission established, among the Huron, Algonquin, or Montagnais, also served as a node of French influence, pushing back against English expansion and asserting Catholic presence in contested lands. The 30 Years' War hardened France's resolve to dominate both Europe and the Atlantic world. Colonial policy became inseparable from global rivalry. 4. England. Fragmented faith, fragile colonies. In contrast to the others, England in the early 1600s was still uncertain, a rising power, but divided at home. Internally, the Church of England faced criticism from Puritans, separatists, and other reformers. Politically, King James I and later Charles I flirted with alliances on both sides of the Continental War, trying to balance Protestant solidarity with dynastic ties to Catholic monarchs. These divisions are split into the colonies. The Virginia Company was a commercial venture, not a religious one. But in New England, religion was paramount. The arrival of the Mayflower in 1620 and the Great Puritan Migration of the 1630s were direct consequences of England's spiritual crisis, itself intensified by the specter of Catholic domination on the continent. To the Puritans, the New World was not just a refuge, it was redemption. They believed God was calling them to build a pure society as Europe descended into heresy and war. Their sermons invoked the same apocalyptic imagery used by Protestant preachers in war-torn Germany: Satan, Babylon, Armageddon. The wilderness was both threat and promise, a canvas on which to build the kingdom of God. Colonial boundaries as geopolitical fronts. Throughout the 1620s and 1630s, these imperial visions clashed, often subtly, sometimes violently. English and French fur traders competed for indigenous alliances in the Northeast. Dutch and English merchants skirmished over control of the Hudson River trade. Jesuits and Protestant settlers competed for the souls and loyalty of native peoples. Spain waged counterintelligence campaigns against Huguenot colonies, such as Fort Caroline, which was destroyed in 1565, but continued to haunt Spanish fears of Protestant intrusion. These weren't formal battlefields like those in Europe. They were ideological fronts, wars of influence, belief, and control. Even Native American nations were drawn into this web. Tribes like the Iroquois, Huron, and Powhatan understood the stakes. They played European powers against each other, trading goods for guns, missions for alliances. In doing so, they shaped colonial destinies as much as kings and generals did. The 30 Years' War didn't just influence colonial America from afar. It bent it, molded it, and weaponized it. By the time peace finally came to Europe in 1648, the colonies had evolved from scattered outposts into extensions of imperial identity. Their religious laws, economic systems, and political alliances all bore the marks of the war. And though the fighting had ended in Europe, the Americas were just getting started. Before it was a battlefield of empires, North America was a battleground of faith. From the rocky shores of New England to the vast rivers of New France, European colonists carried more than muskets and maps. They carried scripture. They carried suspicion. They took centuries of hatred, the kind only religious war can refine. And in the shadow of Europe's 30 Years' War, they cast the American wilderness as a theater of divine destiny. To understand early colonization, you must know that these were not just settlers. They were missionaries, dissidents, crusaders. They came to America with their God in one hand and their enemies' sins in the other. The continent's conquest, in many ways, was a war of altars, the religious logic of empire. The 30 Years' War had turned Europe into a furnace of fanaticism. Catholic and Protestant armies torched cities and shattered kingdoms in the name of theological absolutes. Tolerance was weakness. Compromise was betrayal. And as this ideological fire raged, the colonies became more than economic ventures. They became sanctuaries and strongholds. For Catholic monarchies like Spain and France, colonization was inseparable from mission. Their empires were not just political, they were spiritual. Every native soul converted was a victory over Protestant heresy. Every mission built was a monument to divine favor. Every Jesuit in a canoe was part of a holy army. For Protestants, especially English Puritans, Dutch Calvinists, and Huguenots, the colonies represented both escape and experiment. Escape from Catholic persecution and a chance to build godly societies free from the corruption of European compromise. But in both cases, faith was fuel. It sanctified conquest, it justified expansion, and it shaped the laws, cultures, and conflicts that defined colonial life. Jesuits in the North, the Catholic Crusade in New France. Perhaps no colonial mission was more directly shaped by the 30 Years' War than the Jesuit campaign in Canada. The Society of Jesus, founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, was the elite order of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Trained in theology, fluent in languages, and disciplined like soldiers, Jesuits were dispatched to the front lines of global evangelization, from China to Brazil to the icy rivers of Quebec. In New France, Jesuits saw the indigenous peoples not as savages, but as souls corrupted by Satan, yet redeemable through Christ. But they also believed that the wilderness itself was hostile, a physical and moral void that had to be ordered through Catholic discipline. The Jesuits embedded themselves in Huron and Algonquin communities. They learned native languages, translated scripture, and built missions deep in the forest. Their goal was not just conversion, it was transformation. To bring indigenous life under the authority of Rome. To remake social structures, marriage customs, gender roles, and cosmologies in the image of the Catholic order. But the results were tragic and complex. Many indigenous people were curious, open to dialogue, intrigued by European power, or politically motivated to align with the French. But others resisted fiercely. Jesuit insistence on moral absolutism often clashed with native customs, particularly around sexuality, polygamy, and ancestral rituals. And then came disease. As smallpox and influenza ravaged indigenous communities, some blamed the Jesuits. Others believed they had magical powers. Some accused them of sorcery. Others saw them as prophets. The line between faith and fear blurred, and always in the background was war, both European and indigenous. The Jesuits arrived during a time of growing conflict between the Huron Confederacy and the powerful Iroquois League. The French, allied with the Huron, were dragged into these ancient rivalries. The Iroquois, armed by the Dutch and later the English, launched brutal attacks on Jesuit missions. Between 1642 and 1649, 8 Jesuit missionaries were killed, often in horrific ways. They would later be canonized as the North American Martyrs, saints of empire, their blood offered as proof of the Catholic mission's righteousness. But martyrdom was not victory. By 1650, the Huron were devastated. The Jesuit dream of a Christianized New France had suffered a fatal blow. And yet, the story endured. Catholic France would continue to pursue its mission, using the martyrdom narrative as moral fuel for future generations. Puritan theocracy, the Protestant experiment in New England. While the Jesuits fought for Catholic souls in the North, English Puritans were building a different vision, not of conversion, but of separation. The Puritans were children of the Reformation, fiercely anti-Catholic, critical of the Anglican Church's perceived compromises, and obsessed with spiritual purity. They saw themselves as the elect, chosen by God to establish a righteous society modeled on biblical law. When they crossed the Atlantic in the 1620s and 1630s, they did so not as empire builders, but as exiles. England, under Charles I, was veering toward Catholic alliances. Europe was ablaze with papist armies. The Puritans believed the apocalypse was near, and that America was their ark. In Massachusetts Bay, they created a theological republic. Church membership was a requirement for political participation. Sermons governed daily life. Education revolved around Scripture, and law was derived directly from the Old Testament. Unlike the Jesuits, who sought to change indigenous peoples through immersion and cultural exchange, the Puritans had little interest in dialogue. To them, the heathen was an obstacle, or worse, an agent of Satan. Yet even among the Puritans, division emerged. Roger Williams, a minister in Salem, condemned the blending of church and state and insisted that native land could not be taken without fair purchase. For these views, he was exiled, and founded Rhode Island, a rare bastion of religious liberty in an otherwise rigid colony. Similarly, Anne Hutchinson, a midwife and spiritual leader, challenged male religious authority and emphasized personal revelation. She too was banished. The New World, even in its piety, made little room for dissent. Still, Puritanism spread, towns multiplied, churches blossomed, and with them came an ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that God had granted them this land and that they were His instruments of judgment and order. That ideology would prove fateful in conflicts like the Pequot War, 1636 to 1638, in which Puritan settlers, allied with rival tribes, annihilated the Pequot nation in a campaign of total war. The justification? Divine mandate. Dutch pluralism. Calvinism meets commerce. In contrast to both Jesuit Catholicism and Puritan theocracy, the Dutch brought a different approach: religious pragmatism. The Dutch Republic, forged in war against Catholic Spain, was founded on Calvinist principles, but it was also a trading nation, and the realities of commerce demanded tolerance. In New Netherland, centered around what is now New York, Dutch authorities allowed a surprising degree of religious diversity. Lutherans, Jews, Quakers, and even Catholics lived side by side, not because the Dutch were modern liberals, but because unity was less important than economic success. Still, the colony had a strong Calvinist backbone. Churches were built, Sabbath laws enforced, and the Dutch Reformed Church retained moral authority. For native peoples, this created both opportunity and confusion. Unlike the rigid Puritans or the paternal Jesuits, the Dutch negotiated alliances based on trade. The Iroquois, in particular, found in the Dutch a valuable partner for fur trading and military support against their French-aligned enemies. But this tolerance had limits. When indigenous groups resisted Dutch authority, governors like Willem Kieft responded with massacres. Most infamously, the Pavonia Massacre of 1643, in which Dutch soldiers slaughtered dozens of Lenape refugees. Religion may not have ruled the colony, but it still justified violence. Faith as frontier law. Across colonial America, religion operated not just in churches and missions, but in every corner of life. It shaped how colonists viewed land, as divinely ordained or spiritually vacant. It shaped how they viewed indigenous peoples, as children to be saved or devils to be removed. It shaped law, labor, gender, education, diplomacy, everything. And because of the 30 Years' War, these convictions were not theoretical. They were sharpened by trauma, fed by martyrdom, and validated by global struggle. Colonists believed they were part of a holy history, a cosmic battle between truth and heresy, light and darkness. This mindset would outlast the war itself. Even after the Peace of Westphalia ended the conflict in Europe in 1648, its religious consequences continued in the colonies, through mission expansion, denominational rivalry, and the birth of ideas such as spiritual liberty and the separation of church and state. Ideas born in resistance, forged in blood, and planted in American soil. In 1620, a creaking wooden vessel called the Mayflower cut through the frigid Atlantic. On board were just over 100 men, women, and children, exhausted, half-starved, and carrying nothing but tools, hope, and a fire that burned from centuries of war and religious persecution. They were not explorers. They were not merchants. They were separatists, fleeing a continent soaked in blood and holy vengeance. The story of the Pilgrims is often told in sanitized myths: Thanksgiving feasts, smiling natives, and the pursuit of vague freedom. But the true roots of their journey lay in a much darker world. a Europe convulsed by religious war, militant absolutism, and the apocalyptic visions of a people convinced they were living at the end of days. The 30 Years' War didn't directly cause the Mayflower to sail, but it formed the storm clouds under which it departed. A Reformation that refused to heal. To understand the Pilgrims, we must begin with the English Reformation, a national break from the Roman Catholic Church under Henry VIII, followed by the establishment of the Church of England. But for many Protestants, especially the Puritans, the Anglican Church had not gone far enough. It retained too many rituals, too much hierarchy, too much Rome. Among the most radical were the Separatists, those who believed the Church of England was beyond redemption and must be abandoned entirely. For this, they were persecuted by English monarchs who saw religious unity as essential to political control. Worship outside the state church was not just heresy, it was treason. The Separatists were driven underground. Secret congregations met in barns, cellars, and forests. They whispered sermons and smuggled texts. Many fled to the more tolerant Dutch Republic, including a group from Scrooby, England, who resettled in Leiden, Holland. There, in exile, they waited, watched, and prayed. But Holland was not home. Life was hard. Work was scarce. And as war spread across the continent, even the tolerant Netherlands grew tense. Spanish forces had devastated Protestant cities just a generation earlier. The fear of Catholic retaliation lingered, and the younger generation of separatists was drifting, culturally and spiritually, in a foreign land. They began to look west. 1620. A voyage into judgment. When the separatists decided to leave Holland and sail for the New World, it wasn't out of opportunism. It was out of necessity and theological urgency. Europe was unraveling. In 1618, the defenestration of Prague had set off the 30 Years' War. Catholic armies were sweeping through Protestant lands. Cities were burning. Jesuits were rising. To the Pilgrims, this was no ordinary war. It was divine judgment. In their sermons and writings, they described Europe as Babylon, a sinful, corrupt, and doomed civilization. The only hope, they believed, was to flee the wrath to come and build a new Jerusalem across the sea. America was not just a refuge, it was a covenant. They were not seeking religious freedom in the modern sense. They were seeking the freedom to build a theocracy, to separate not only from the Church of England, but from all compromise, all impurity, all false doctrine. They believed they were God's elect, tasked with founding a pure community in preparation for Christ's return. The Mayflower became their ark. The wilderness is their proving ground. The voyage is a sacred passage, but nothing went as planned. The failed landing and a new covenant. The Pilgrims had intended to settle near the Hudson River, within the bounds of the Virginia Company's territory, but storms and navigational errors pushed them north into what is now Massachusetts. Technically, they had landed outside any legal charter. They were in a legal and political no-man's land. Fearing disorder and rebellion, they drafted a new agreement, the Mayflower Compact. This document, just 200 words long, was not a constitution, but a covenant. It pledged loyalty to the English crown and committed the settlers to just and equal laws established by mutual consent. But more importantly, it grounded their authority not in kings, but in God and one another. It was a radical experiment in self-governance, born not of Enlightenment reason, but of apocalyptic theology. The Pilgrims saw themselves as a new Israel, bound together in a holy mission to establish a righteous commonwealth. Their colony would not be a market or a plantation. It would be a church, built in the image of Scripture, sustained by discipline, and prepared for the second coming. A world of death and providence. The land where they landed was eerily empty. Unknown to them, a plague had swept through New England just 3 years earlier, likely leptospirosis, killing up to 90% of the coastal indigenous population. The forests were quiet, villages abandoned, cornfields overgrown. To the Pilgrims, this was not a coincidence. It was providence. They believed God had cleared the land for them. In their journals, they recorded this with awe. William Bradford, governor of the colony, wrote, "But for the natives, they are nearly all dead. Thus, God made room for us." But this theology masked a brutal reality. The survivors, including the Wampanoag, were watching, wary. Chief Massasoit, facing his own political crisis, offered a fragile peace in the form of an alliance. For a time, it held. But suspicion and cultural distance made war inevitable. The Pilgrims did not seek coexistence. They sought purity. And that purity, as it had in Europe, would be defended with force if necessary. A shield built from Scripture. What made the Pilgrims unique was not their suffering. Many people suffered. It was their interpretation of suffering. Every hardship, every death, every crop failure or illness was a test, a divine lesson. Their sermons told them they were Job, or Moses, or Israel in the desert. The land of America was not a new beginning, it was a trial. This mentality hardened them. It made them resilient. It made them suspicious, and it made them capable of terrible things in the name of righteousness. As more ships arrived, bringing other Puritans, non-separatists, and Anglican dissenters, tensions grew. The Pilgrims were not interested in building a pluralistic colony. They wanted uniformity, holiness, and submission to their interpretation of divine will. Those who dissented, like Thomas Morton, who founded the Libertine colony of Marymount, or Roger Williams, who questioned the right to seize native land, were exiled, imprisoned, or worse. The shield the Pilgrims carried was forged from Scripture and war, a defensive theology born in Europe's bloodiest century and planted in American soil. The long shadow of European conflict. Though the 30 Years' War never reached New England's shores, its impact was deeply felt. The Pilgrims saw themselves as a remnant, a chosen few escaping the ruin of a damned continent. They viewed Catholicism as not just a false faith, but a demonic power. The Jesuits in Canada were not missionaries. They were enemies. The Church of England was not a compromise. It was apostasy. This black and white worldview, sharpened by European war, shaped early American identity in profound ways. It sowed the seeds of religious exclusivism, the idea that only one form of worship was valid; colonial exceptionalism, the belief that America was divinely chosen; militant separatism, the readiness to enforce purity through exile or violence; apocalyptic nationalism, the conviction that America's destiny was tied to prophecy. And while the Mayflower voyage became a symbol of liberty in later centuries, its original purpose was something far more radical and far more severe. It was not about tolerance, it was about salvation through separation. By the time the 30 Years' War ended in 1648, the Pilgrims had long since buried their dead, built their villages, and begun exporting their faith. New England was growing. Puritanism was taking root, and the theological scars of Europe had been etched into American foundations. The peace treaties in Europe promoted tolerance, sovereignty, secular diplomacy. But in America, the Pilgrims had already chosen their path, a fortress of faith in a wilderness they believed had been cleared by God's wrath. They were not builders of compromise, They were survivors of the storm. In the shadow of Europe's most brutal religious war, the Dutch chose a different path. While Catholic and Protestant monarchs bled each other dry in the 30 Years' War, and while English Puritans sailed west with apocalyptic sermons in their satchels, the Dutch Republic saw something else in the New World: opportunity. They saw rivers to be mapped, for it to be traded, ports to be fortified, souls to be saved, maybe, but only after the ledgers are balanced. The Dutch did not come to America to build a city on a hill. They came to build a global trading empire. And in doing so, they laid the foundations of a colonial experiment unlike any other in North America, one that fused Calvinist theology, religious tolerance, and brutal capitalism into a model of imperial ambition shaped as much by war as by wealth. The birth of a republic at war. To understand Dutch colonization, one must begin with the Revolution. The Dutch Republic, formerly known as the United Provinces, was born out of the 80 Years' War, 1568 to 1648, a revolt against Spanish Catholic rule. What began as a rebellion against taxation and absolutism became a war for religious and national independence. The Dutch were Calvinists, followers of a strict Protestant theology that emphasized predestination, moral discipline, and the sovereignty of God in all things. In their view, the Catholic Church was not just corrupted, it was anti-Christ. But unlike their Puritan cousins in England, the Dutch Calvinists had learned a hard lesson through war. Survival required pragmatism. Their economy relied on trade. Their cities thrived on diversity. And so, even while their national identity was Calvinist, their society became remarkably tolerant. Jews fleeing persecution in Iberia, Huguenots from France, Anabaptists, Lutherans, all found refuge in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Leiden. It was not always out of compassion. Often, it was out of necessity. Religious diversity made trade easier. It kept the ports humming. This pragmatism would define Dutch policy in the New World. The Dutch West India Company, empire by corporation. In 1621, 3 years after the start of the 30 Years' War, the Dutch established the Dutch West India Company, WEC. It was no ordinary trading firm. Chartered by the government, it was given quasi-sovereign power to wage war, establish colonies, sign treaties, and govern foreign lands. It was a nation in corporate form, a company with cannons. Its twin goals were simple: break Spanish and Portuguese control of Atlantic trade, extract wealth from the Americas, Africa, and beyond. To do this, it launched a series of military raids and colonial projects, from Brazil to the Caribbean and, crucially, to the North American coast. In 1624, the WIC established a permanent Dutch presence at the mouth of the Hudson River, New Netherland. At its heart was New Amsterdam, today New York City. Missionaries or religious refugees did not found New Netherland. Merchants, agents, and administrators founded it. Its primary purpose was to exploit the fur trade, particularly beaver pelts, through alliances with local indigenous nations. But that didn't mean it was faithless. The colony operated under the religious framework of Dutch Calvinism. Churches were established. Ministers were sent. The Dutch Reformed Church had official status, and Sabbath laws were enforced. But there was a difference, a profound one, from the Puritan colonies to the north. In Massachusetts, dissent was exile. In New Netherland, dissent was tolerated. The WIC, ever mindful of trade, allowed other Protestants, Lutherans, Mennonites, even English Puritans, to worship in private. They allowed Sephardic Jews, expelled from Brazil after Portuguese reconquest, to settle and eventually build the first Jewish community in North America. They allowed free blacks to own property, marry, and even petition for manumission, long before such rights existed in English colonies. This was not liberalism as we know it. It was colonial pragmatism. The WIC needed settlers. It needed labor. It needed peace between diverse communities so trade could flourish. And so, it managed difference, not by eliminating it, but by containing it. But that tolerance had limits: warfare, slavery, and empire. Behind the surface of tolerance and trade was a darker reality. The Dutch West India Company was not just a merchant venture. It was a militarized machine, driven by the logic of profit through domination. In West Africa, the WIC built slave forts, including Elmina and Gorée, to capture and export enslaved Africans. In the Caribbean, Dutch privateers raided Spanish ships and colonies, seeking silver, sugar, and strategic ports. And in New Netherland, when diplomacy failed, the company turned to war. In the early 1640s, Governor Willem Kieft launched a series of brutal attacks against the Lenape and other neighboring tribes. His policies sparked the Kieft's War, 1643 to 1645, a bloody and destructive conflict that devastated indigenous villages and left New Netherland deeply unstable. Even fellow Dutch colonists protested Kieft's actions. He had violated the fragile balance of trade and diplomacy that had made the colony successful. His violence was bad for business. He was eventually recalled to the Netherlands, a rare case in which corporate failure led to consequences. But the pattern remained: tolerance at home, domination abroad. The same system that allowed a Jew to open a shop in New Amsterdam also enslaved Africans on sugar plantations in Curaçao. The Sassame Company, which signed peace treaties with the Iroquois, also armed them in wars against their neighbors. The indigenous dimension: diplomacy and guns. The Dutch understood that their survival in New Netherland depended on indigenous alliances. Unlike the English, who saw native land as a blank slate, the Dutch treated native nations as political actors. They traded with the Mohawk and Mohican. They negotiated with the Lenape. They established covenant chains, long-term diplomatic frameworks, particularly with the Iroquois Confederacy. These alliances were transactional, not paternalistic. The Dutch did not attempt mass conversion. There were no widespread mission schools. Instead, they offered goods for pelts, weapons for allegiance, and alcohol for compliance. It was a cold calculus, and it often sowed chaos. By supplying the Iroquois with firearms, the Dutch helped fuel the Beaver Wars, a series of conflicts in which the Iroquois expanded their power across the Great Lakes, devastating rival tribes like the Huron and Erie. These wars were not just native conflicts. They were shaped by European markets, driven by demand for furs, and armed by foreign steel. In this way, the Dutch became co-authors of indigenous violence, not through ideology, but through economics. Tensions within. Faith versus commerce. The Calvinist ministers in New Netherland often clashed with company officials. They wanted strict moral enforcement. The company wanted tax revenue. Ministers denounced drunkenness, loose living, and Sabbath breaking. Merchants prioritized trade. The result was a colony constantly balancing between spiritual conformity and economic pluralism. This tension reached a peak under the governorship of Peter Stuyvesant, 1647 to 1664, a devout Calvinist and strict disciplinarian. He tried to crack down on non-reformed churches, including Lutherans and Jews. But the company overruled him. In a now famous petition, the Jewish community appealed directly to the directors in Amsterdam. The company responded, "We cannot refuse them, as we also have to treat them well for the benefit of the trade." commerce won. In 1664, during the Anglo-Dutch conflict, English warships sailed into New Amsterdam's harbor. Stuyvesant, with little support, surrendered the colony. The English renamed it New York. New Netherland was gone, but its legacy remained. Its laws on property rights and religious toleration influenced later colonial policies. Its cultural diversity laid the groundwork for the pluralism of modern New York. Its economic model, corporate-led colonization, would be imitated by later empires. Its moral tensions between faith and profit, order and freedom, still echo today. And behind it all, its creation was inseparable from war. The 30 Years' War in Europe, the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands, and the global struggle for trade supremacy shaped every decision the Dutch made. They saw the New World not as a sanctuary, but as a gamble. A gambit made in the hopes that commerce could succeed where theology and swords had failed. In 1618, as Europe descended into the 30 Years' War, the French crown sharpened not just its swords, but its crosses. For France, the war was both political and sacred. It was a struggle to contain the Habsburgs, defend royal interests, and preserve the soul of the Catholic world. But even as cannon fire echoed across the Rhineland, France looked west, to a land of rivers and forests, of souls and trade. New France. Here, across the Atlantic, France would extend not just its empire, but its faith. And yet, the spiritual destiny of French America was never simple. It was shaped by contradiction. Between the king's absolute Catholicism and the flickering hopes of French Protestants, between Jesuit devotion and colonial ambition, between saving souls and securing furs. In the wilderness of North America, France wielded both the crucifix and the sword, and found itself torn between unity and diversity, conviction and survival. France in the age of religious trauma. France had entered the 17th century bloodied by religious war. From 1562 to 1598, it had endured the French Wars of Religion, a violent struggle between Catholics and Huguenots, French Calvinists. Cities burned, neighbors killed neighbors, tens of thousands died. The trauma culminated in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when Catholic mobs, encouraged by royal factions, slaughtered thousands of Huguenots in Paris and across the kingdom. The wounds cut deep. In 1598, King Henry IV, himself a former Huguenot, issued the Edict of Nantes, granting Protestants limited tolerance. It was a fragile peace, based on pragmatism more than reconciliation. But when Louis XIII came to power, especially under the influence of Cardinal Richelieu, France began to reverse course. Religious unity became state policy. Catholicism was not just favored, it was enforced. And that policy would shape colonial ambitions. New France, a Catholic empire of souls. The French colonies in North America, centered in Quebec, founded in 1608, were never as populous as their English or Spanish rivals. But what they lacked in settlers, they made up for in missionary zeal. From the outset, New France was framed as a dual enterprise, economic and evangelical. The fur trade brought wealth, but the conversion of indigenous peoples was seen as a holy duty. France's Catholic monarchy believed that its American colonies were extensions of a divine mandate to spread the one true faith. At the center of this mission stood the Jesuits. The Jesuit vision. The Society of Jesus, the intellectual and spiritual shock troops of the Counter-Reformation, played an outsized role in shaping New France. Trained in linguistics, philosophy, and cultural immersion, Jesuit missionaries saw themselves not just as teachers, but as martyrs in waiting. They ventured deep into indigenous lands, to Huron, Algonquin, and montagnard villages, learning native languages, recording ethnographies, and translating scripture. Their writings, collected in the Jesuit Relations, remain among the most detailed accounts of early indigenous life in the Americas, though filtered through a theological lens. The Jesuits were not content with superficial conversions. They aimed to reshape entire worldviews. They sought to replace seasonal ceremonies with Christian sacraments, oral tradition with catechism, and clan leaders with parish priests. But they faced profound resistance. Many indigenous people found Jesuit teachings incompatible with their ways of life. Conversion often meant abandoning communal rituals, kinship ties, and spiritual traditions rooted in land, animals, and ancestral spirits. Some converted strategically to gain favor, trade access, or protection. Others saw the Jesuits as dangerous, especially after the disease swept through villages. Disease, death, and martyrdom. The most devastating consequence of contact was not doctrine, but epidemic. As in New England, indigenous communities in Canada had no immunity to Old World diseases. Smallpox, measles, and influenza all arrived with French traders and missionaries. Mortality rates were catastrophic. Despite this, the Jesuits persisted. Between 1642 and 1649, several Jesuits were captured and killed during escalating conflicts between the Huron, French allies, and the Iroquois Confederacy, increasingly aligned with Dutch and English interests. Men like Jean de Brébeuf and Gabriel Lalemant were tortured and executed, their flesh burned, their hearts torn out, their remains later enshrined as relics. They became the North American martyrs, canonized by the Church and revered as examples of unwavering faithfulness. Their deaths fueled recruitment. Their stories were published in Europe as evidence that the mission field was a site of holy struggle, that the Americas were not just contested by empire, but by heaven and hell. Huguenots in exile, the Protestant dream denied. While Catholic France pursued missionary conquest in the north, French Protestants, the Huguenots, looked elsewhere. Some dreamed of their own colonies, places of refuge and freedom of religion. The most famous of these was Fort Caroline, founded in 1564 in what is now Florida. Sponsored by Admiral Coligny and composed of Huguenot settlers, it was a fragile Protestant beachhead in a Catholic world. But Spain, defending its claim to Florida and its role as Catholic enforcer, would not tolerate it. In 1565, Spanish troops under Pedro Menéndez de Avilés attacked Fort Caroline, massacring nearly all of its inhabitants, many after they had surrendered. Survivors were hanged under signs that read, "Not as Frenchmen, but as heretics." The message was clear: there would be no Protestant France in America. By the early 1600s, France's monarchy, especially under Richelieu, increasingly restricted Protestant emigration. The colonies, like the homeland, were to be unified in faith. Some Huguenots fled to the Dutch Republic or English colonies. A few found quiet lives in New France, often hiding their beliefs. But the official line was firm: Catholicism ruled. This exclusion was a missed opportunity. While the English colonies expanded rapidly, fed by waves of dissenters and sectarian diversity, French America remained small, tightly controlled, slow-growing, and spiritually uniform. Empire built on fragile ground. For all its zeal, New France was fragile. Its settlements were scattered. Its population was tiny, just a few thousand by the mid-1600s. Its economy relied heavily on the fur trade, which depended on indigenous alliances increasingly strained by warfare and disease. And while the Jesuits brought spiritual infrastructure, they also brought political entanglement. By embedding themselves in Huron society, they bound New France's fate to Huron survival. When the Iroquois launched devastating attacks in the late 1640s, destroying Huron villages and scattering survivors, the entire missionary network collapsed. The French crown responded with military fortifications and tighter control. In 1663, Louis XIV revoked the colony's charter and made it a royal province. From then on, New France would be governed directly from Versailles, with bishops, generals, and bureaucrats enforcing the king's will. The colony became more Catholic than ever, but no closer to security. Huguenots in exile, the Protestant dream. Denied while Catholic France pursued missionary conquest in the north, French Protestants, the Huguenots, looked elsewhere. Some dreamed of their own colonies, places of refuge and freedom of religion. The most famous of these was Fort Caroline, founded in 1564 in what is now Florida. Sponsored by Admiral Coligny and composed of Huguenot settlers, it was a fragile Protestant beachhead in a Catholic world. But Spain, defending its claim to Florida and its role as Catholic enforcer, would not tolerate it. In 1565, Spanish troops under Pedro Menéndez de Avilés attacked Fort Caroline, massacring nearly all of its inhabitants, many after they had surrendered. Survivors were hanged under signs that read, not as Frenchmen, but as heretics. The message was clear: there would be no Protestant France in America. By the early 1600s, France's monarchy, especially under Richelieu, increasingly restricted Protestant emigration. The colonies, like the homeland, were to be unified in faith. Some Huguenots fled to the Dutch Republic or English colonies. A few found quiet lives in New France, often hiding their beliefs. But the official line was firm: Catholicism ruled. This exclusion was a missed opportunity. While the English colonies expanded rapidly, fed by waves of dissenters and sectarian diversity, French America remained small, tightly controlled, slow-growing, and spiritually uniform. Empire built on fragile ground. For all its zeal, New France was fragile. Its settlements were scattered. Its population was tiny, just a few thousand by the mid-1600s. Its economy relied heavily on the fur trade, which depended on indigenous alliances increasingly strained by warfare and disease. And while the Jesuits brought spiritual infrastructure, they also brought political entanglement. By embedding themselves in Huron society, they bound New France's fate to Huron survival. When the Iroquois launched devastating attacks in the late 1640s, destroying Huron villages and scattering survivors, the entire missionary network collapsed. The French crown responded with military fortifications and tighter control. In 1663, Louis XIV revoked the colony's charter and made it a royal province. From then on, New France would be governed directly from Versailles, with bishops, generals, and bureaucrats enforcing the king's will. The colony became more Catholic than ever, but no closer to security. Legacy, unity, ruin, and memory. France's colonial experiment in faith was marked by grandeur and tragedy. The Jesuits brought literacy, medicine, and a passionate sense of purpose. But they also helped dismantle indigenous cultures and justified imperialism with scripture. The Huguenots, denied a place in the French colonies, helped populate rival settlements, bringing skills, capital, and ambition to England, the Netherlands, and later, the Carolinas. And the French crown, in enforcing religious unity, constrained its own colonial potential, trading diversity for control and expansion for orthodoxy. By the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, France had emerged as Europe's dominant Catholic power, triumphant over the Habsburgs, ascendant in continental politics. But its North American empire remained small, vulnerable, and rigid. A mirror of France's absolutist dreams, but one that would eventually shatter under the weight of war, revolution, and the rise of pluralist empires. Still, the echo of France's Catholic sword lingers, in place, names, in memory, and in the ruins of mission outposts lost to time. By the early 1600s, the Spanish Empire ruled the largest colonial domain the world had ever seen. Its banners flew over the Andes and the Amazon, the deserts of Mexico, and the swamps of Florida. Gold and silver flowed from the mines of Potosí and Zacatecas into the vaults of Madrid and the cathedrals of Seville. Its priests baptized entire nations, and its galleons stitched together a global economy that reached from Manila to Mexico to Madrid. But behind the illusion of infinite power, Spain was bleeding. It was bleeding men, bleeding silver, bleeding empire. The 30 Years' War, though centered in Central Europe, would mark a turning point in Spanish imperial decline, a decline shaped as much by European bloodshed as by colonial overreach. While France, England, and the Netherlands carved new paths in the Americas, Spain fought desperately to maintain an empire too large to govern and too expensive to defend. And though the battles were fought in Bohemia and Bavaria, the empire's foundations trembled in Mexico, Peru, Florida, and deep within the veins of overworked miners. Spain's empire at its peak and breaking point. At the dawn of the 17th century, Spain stood as the dominant global superpower. Under the Habsburg dynasty, it ruled over the Iberian Peninsula, the Low Countries, modern Belgium and the Netherlands, parts of Italy, vast stretches of the Americas, the Philippines, and other Pacific outposts. But this power was brittle. It depended on a constant influx of wealth, particularly silver, to finance its armies and royal expenditures. The crown's domestic tax base was weak. Its economy relied on imported goods, and its bureaucracy, bloated and inefficient, struggled to manage far-flung territories. The Spanish Road, a military supply route stretching from northern Italy to the Netherlands, and the vast fleets crossing the Atlantic were fueled by American silver. Without it, Spain's armies would starve, its allies would falter, and its global system would collapse. And then came war. The weight of the 30 Years' War. Though the 30 Years' War began as a localized conflict in Bohemia, it quickly drew Spain into the maelstrom. As a Catholic power, Spain rushed to support the Austrian Habsburgs, their imperial cousins, against Protestant rebels. Spanish troops fought on the Rhine, in Alsace, and across the German states. But Spain's true obsession remained the Netherlands. The 80 Years' War, Spain's long and brutal attempt to suppress the Protestant Dutch revolt, had drained Spanish coffers for decades. When the truce with the Dutch expired in 1621, just as the 30 Years' War escalated, Spain found itself fighting on multiple fronts against various enemies, with a treasury already cracking. To sustain its campaigns, the Spanish crown doubled down on colonial extraction. Shipments of silver from Potosí and Zacatecas were taxed more heavily. Indigenous labor systems, like the repartimiento and the mita, were intensified. Encomenderos and royal agents demanded higher quotas. Mercury mines in Huancavelica were pushed to their limits, as the patio process of silver refining required massive inputs of the toxic metal. The human cost was catastrophic. Colonial strain and exploitation. In the silver mines of Upper Peru, modern Bolivia, indigenous laborers, often conscripted through the restructured Inca Mita system, worked under horrific conditions. Exhaustion, mercury poisoning, cave-ins, and disease claimed thousands each year. Families were torn apart as young men were sent on rotational labor drafts, many of whom never returned home. Entire villages in the Andean highlands were depopulated to feed the imperial machine. Meanwhile, in New Spain, Mexico, the crown leaned heavily on the riches of Zacatecas and Guanajuato. The city of Zacatecas, a boomtown of wealth and death, produced tons of silver that were hauled overland to Veracruz, loaded onto galleons, and sent to Seville. These shipments funded Spain's war effort in Europe, but at home, they bred instability. The relentless focus on extraction left the Americas underdefended and politically fragile. Resources that could have strengthened fortifications, settlements, and local governance were instead funneled into Europe's endless war. In Florida, settlements like St. Augustine languished. In New Mexico, fragile missions were left isolated. In the Caribbean, pirates and rival navies, mainly Dutch and English privateers, grew bold, sensing Spain's weakness. Even within the heart of the empire, cracks deepened. Piracy, rebellion, and internal decay, the 30 Years' War coincided with a surge in maritime raiding and piracy across the Atlantic. The Dutch, now backed by a powerful merchant navy and driven by hatred for their former overlords, launched attacks on Spanish shipping lanes. Dutch privateers captured Bahia, Brazil, raided Puerto Rico, and even threatened Havana. The English, though not formal participants in the war until late, sent privateers and adventurers, men like Henry Morgan, to disrupt Spanish shipping and plunder Caribbean outposts. Meanwhile, within Spanish America, internal rebellion simmered. In 1624, riots erupted in Mexico City over food shortages and government corruption. In Peru, indigenous resistance to forced labor never entirely disappeared. Minor revolts, escape networks, and passive resistance slowed production. In the Philippines, Muslim and Chinese rebellions tested Spain's eastern flank, especially as resources were diverted to Europe. The Crown's response was to tighten control, imposing new viceroys, royal inspections, and more centralized taxation. But this only deepened resentment among local elites, indigenous leaders, and mixed-race populations seeking autonomy. The empire was held together by ships and silver, both of which were under siege. The limits of silver, inflation and economic collapse. Perhaps the most bitter irony of the Spanish imperial model was this: the very silver that powered its armies also undermined its economy. By the 1630s, Spain was facing crippling inflation. The flood of American bullion devalued currency across Europe. Prices soared. Wages stagnated. The Crown borrowed heavily from foreign bankers, often using future silver shipments as collateral. When shipments were delayed, by storms, piracy, or rebellion, the royal treasury defaulted. In 1627, Spain declared bankruptcy. Again. It had done so before, in 1557 and 1575. But the 1627 default came at a time of maximum vulnerability. With wars on multiple fronts, internal decay, and a treasury in chaos, Spain's imperial machinery began to seize up. By the 1640s, the once mighty Habsburg Empire was limping. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, confirmed what had already become clear. Spain's moment had passed. It recognized Dutch independence, lost territory in Northern Europe, and watched as France emerged as the new Catholic power on the continent. The war was over, but the damage had been done. North America, the forgotten frontier. While Spain maintained dominance in Mexico, Central America, and the Andes, its North American territories were increasingly neglected. Settlements in Florida, Texas, and New Mexico were underfunded and vulnerable. Native resistance, harsh climates, and long supply lines made these areas difficult to defend. Without silver, they offered little incentive, yet they formed the buffer zone against English and French encroachment. Spain's religious orders, particularly the Franciscans, continued missionary work in the Southwest. But without strong military backing, many missions remained precarious outposts. Conflicts with the Pueblo and Apache peoples persisted. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, decades after the war's end, would see Spanish settlers driven out of New Mexico entirely for over a decade. The 30 Years' War didn't just exhaust Spain and Europe, it also exhausted. It hollowed out its ability to adapt in the Americas. As France, England, and the Netherlands began constructing dynamic, pluralistic, and trade-driven colonial societies, Spain clung to a decaying model of extraction and orthodoxy. A haunted empire. In the years following the war, Spain remained a vast empire, but it was an exhausted one. Its people overtaxed, its colonies are restless, its enemies are emboldened. The silver strain of the 30 Years' War had revealed the central contradiction of the Spanish Empire: that an empire built on wealth without reform, on expansion without investment, on conquest without adaptation, could only burn so brightly before it collapsed under its own weight. By 1648, the maps still showed Spanish flags across 2 continents, but the twilight had begun. When the guns fell silent in 1648, Central Europe lay in ruins. The Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War, but what remained was a shattered world. Villages were gone, cities emptied. Fields, once golden with wheat, grew wild with weeds. The Holy Roman Empire, that chaotic patchwork of over 300 principalities, had become a graveyard of empires and peasants alike. Millions were dead, from starvation, plague, fire, and blade. But not all perished. Some fled, some wandered, and some, years later, crossed an ocean. Though the United States would not be born for another century, the roots of one of its most significant immigrant groups, the German-speaking peoples, lay in the smoking ruins of the 30 Years' War. This chapter explores the long ripple of that destruction, how a continent's trauma gave rise to a quiet, determined migration that reshaped British America, not through conquest, but through culture, faith, and community. The war that shattered a continent. Between 1618 and 1648, the 30 Years' War killed as many as 8 million people, mainly within the fractured territories of the Holy Roman Empire, encompassing modern-day Germany, Austria, Czechia, Switzerland, and parts of France and Poland. Though it began as a Protestant-Catholic conflict, it evolved into a broader struggle for dominance among the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, and other minor German princes. Armies, foreign and domestic, marched through the land like plagues. They looted towns, burned farms, desecrated churches, raped and murdered civilians. Soldiers lived off the land, and the land was exhausted. The German countryside, once among the most densely populated and productive in Europe, became a patchwork of famine and flight. Entire regions lost more than 50% of their population. Cities like Magdeburg, sacked in 1631 by Imperial forces, became symbols of annihilation. Of its 30,000 residents, fewer than 5,000 survived. The rest were slaughtered or burned alive. And when the war finally ended, peace brought little comfort. The economy was broken, trade collapsed, disease lingered. The social fabric, guilds, churches, town councils, had been shredded. Those who remained behind would try to rebuild. But others, especially radical Protestant minorities, began to look westward. The rise of religious refugees. Among the most affected by the war were Anabaptists, Mennonites, Pietists, and Reformed Lutherans, sects that had often found themselves caught between Catholic suppression and Protestant state churches. The Peace of Westphalia granted rulers the right to determine their territory's official religion, cuius regio, ius religio, meaning that if your prince was Catholic, so were you. If he were Lutheran, so were you. Those who disagreed faced expulsion or persecution. This left tens of thousands of families spiritually homeless, tolerated nowhere, loyal to no throne, and clinging to their own forms of worship in barns, caves, or forests. These weren't nobles or merchants. They were farmers, millers, weavers. They asked not for power, only peace. But in a post-war Europe obsessed with control, even peace was hard to find. And so the seeds of future emigration were planted, long before the ships sailed. England's new role: protector of the persecuted. In the aftermath of the war, England began to position itself as a Protestant protector. Though it had remained mostly on the sidelines of the 30 Years' War, England watched with horror as Protestant communities were wiped out across the continent. The English press published pamphlets detailing atrocities against German Lutherans, Czech Hussites, and Swiss Reformed churches. This was no accident. The early 1600s were a time of increasing English Protestant identity. The civil wars in Britain, the rise of Puritanism, and the execution of Charles I in 1649 all reinforced the idea that England was a sanctuary for true faith and a bulwark against Rome. This Protestant nationalism extended to the New World. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, as more German-speaking refugees sought safety, England, and especially its North American colonies, became a beacon. The first German arrivals in the English colonies. The earliest trickle of German-speaking settlers into British America began in the late 1600s, but it wasn't until the 1700s that the flow became a migration. Still, the roots go back to the war's aftermath. Some notable early settlements include Germantown, Pennsylvania, 1683. Founded by a group of German Mennonites and Quakers seeking religious freedom. They were invited by William Penn, himself a radical dissenter who envisioned Pennsylvania as a holy experiment of tolerance. New York's Hudson Valley. After the English took New Netherland from the Dutch in 1664, they inherited communities that included German-speaking Lutherans and Reformed Protestants. Over time, more arrivals settled along the Hudson, contributing to the region's diversity. South Carolina. A small but significant group of German Swiss settled in the backcountry, drawn by offers of land and freedom from military conscription. These settlers did not arrive in conquest, but in search of peace, and they brought with them something precious: skills, discipline, and a deep suspicion of tyranny. Cultural legacy, faith, farming, and freedom. German-speaking immigrants profoundly shaped colonial America, especially in the Middle Colonies. Though they arrived decades after the 30 Years' War ended, their cultural memory of it endured. They remembered the pillaged villages, the burnt churches, the forced conversions. They remembered the trauma of being pawns in princes' games. And in America, they are determined to build something different. 1. Faith without force. Most German immigrants were intensely religious, but also deeply committed to nonviolence, tolerance, and local autonomy. Mennonites, Brethren, and other peace churches refused to serve in the military. Many refused to swear oaths. They believed in inward faith, not outward display. 2. Agricultural genius. German farmers brought advanced techniques in crop rotation, barn design, and soil management. They transformed the Pennsylvania backcountry into some of the most productive farmland in North America. 3. Communalism and education. German-speaking settlers valued community decision-making, printed newspapers in their own language, and established some of the first bilingual schools. Their presence added linguistic and cultural complexity to the English colonies, and a model of pluralism without chaos. 4. Resistance to slavery. While not uniformly abolitionist, many German Protestant communities, especially in Pennsylvania, became early critics of slavery. The 1688 Germantown Quaker petition against slavery was one of the first written protests against human bondage in the colonies. The long memory of war, though few German settlers spoke explicitly of the 30 Years' War, its memory was embedded in their worldview. It shaped their distrust of standing armies. It fueled their rejection of state churches. It taught them that governments, when fused with religious absolutism, could destroy civilizations. And so, in quiet valleys and along wooded creeks, they built a new kind of community. Not utopian, not always harmonious, but durable, modest, and resilient. Their influence grew with time. By the time of the American Revolution, German-speaking settlers made up over 10% of the population in some colonies. Many would fight for independence. Others remained neutral, wary of yet another war. But all had been shaped, directly or indirectly, by the refugee currents set in motion by Europe's longest war. Today, the cultural echoes of this migration remain. The Pennsylvania Dutch, from Deutsch, kept their language alive for centuries. Lutheran and Mennonite churches dot the landscape of the American Midwest. Traditions of nonviolence, community schooling, and local governance trace back to Anabaptist ideals. And millions of Americans of German descent still carry surnames that once fled across the ocean. The story of the 30 Years' War is often told in terms of princes and generals, treaties and battlefields. But its most lasting impact may lie not in the treaties of Westphalia, but in the quiet decisions of families who said, "Never again," and chose to leave behind a continent of blood for the uncertain hope of freedom. They brought no banners, they raised no forts, but they reshaped America from the soil up. After 30 years of slaughter, starvation, and disease, Europe finally laid down its arms. In 1648, a series of treaties known collectively as the Peace of Westphalia ended the most devastating conflict the continent had ever seen. The cities of Münster and Osnabrück, where exhausted diplomats gathered, were not only sites of negotiation, they were grave markers for a shattered world. What emerged from these treaties would not just shape the future of Europe, but would echo across the Atlantic, influencing the very structure of colonial rule, the ideology of statehood, and eventually the birth of American political identity. The 30 Years' War had begun as a desperate struggle over religion, with Protestant and Catholic armies clashing across the patchwork quilt of the Holy Roman Empire. But over time, it became something else, a war of dynastic rivalry, of imperial ambition, of sheer survival. Entire regions of Central Europe were reduced to wastelands. Populations were decimated. Economies collapsed. By 1648, the war had killed as many as 8 million people, the vast majority of them civilians. No side emerged victorious. There was no triumph, only exhaustion. The Peace of Westphalia was, in many ways, a radical break from Europe's past. For the first time, diplomacy was centered not on universal empires or religious orthodoxy, but on sovereign equality. The treaties recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic and the Swiss Confederacy, confirmed the decline of Habsburg supremacy, and carved out new balances of power between Catholic and Protestant states. Most crucially, Westphalia established the foundational principle that each ruler could determine the religion of their own state, while also protecting religious minorities from persecution. This wasn't tolerance in the modern sense, but it was a significant step away from the absolutist zeal that had fueled decades of war. Though the agreements were negotiated in Europe, their consequences rippled outward, all the way to the Americas. The ideological shift that Westphalia signaled, away from religious empire and toward pragmatic, territorially defined state power, helped shape how European nations viewed their colonies. No longer were colonies seen merely as religious missions or ideological proving grounds. They became instruments of national interest, extensions of the sovereign state, not of a universal Christendom. This mattered immensely in a colonial world already defined by overlapping claims, competing theologies, and fragile footholds. In New France, the Jesuit missions that had once imagined a Catholic theocracy among indigenous peoples began to evolve into tools of French national strategy. The martyrdom of missionaries like Jean de Brébeuf was still revered, but the French crown now focused on fortifying outposts and cultivating alliances, particularly with the Huron and Algonquin. In New Netherland, the Dutch, emerging as a sovereign republic formally recognized at Westphalia, doubled down on their commercial empire, using trade, not theology, as the engine of expansion. And in English colonies like Virginia and Massachusetts, the memory of religious persecution remained strong. But so too did the slow emergence of self-governance, the belief that local assemblies, bound by covenants and charters, could govern without interference from distant kings. Westphalia also transformed the diplomatic imagination. Before 1648, wars were often waged for religious reasons, to defend the true faith, to crush heresy, to fulfill divine will. After Westphalia, wars were increasingly fought over national interests, resources, trade routes, and influence. This shift is crucial to understanding imperial competition in the Americas over the next century. The battles between England and France in the New World, the expansion into indigenous territory, the rush to control rivers, forts, and harbors, all these would be justified not as acts of spiritual warfare, but as manifestations of sovereign right. The world was entering the age of the modern state. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Westphalia was conceptual. It introduced an idea that would later take root in the minds of colonial Americans, the notion that political legitimacy stems from secular authority, not divine appointment. By reducing the power of the Pope and ending the dream of a unified Christendom, Westphalia made room, however unintentionally, for pluralism, secularism, and eventually, popular sovereignty. These ideas would take a century to mature, but the seeds were planted in 1648 on the battlefields of Europe and in the scrolls of exhausted diplomats. In British America, the impact was slower, but no less significant. As European powers shifted from crusaders to administrators, their colonial policies began to reflect the Westphalian model. Local governors were appointed not as missionaries, but as agents of the crown. Colonial assemblies gained more autonomy, especially in places like Pennsylvania, where religious diversity demanded political compromise. The very structure of colonies, with defined borders, legal codes, and recognizable governments, mirrored the emerging idea of the state as a bounded, secular authority. This transition was crucial in the religious sphere. In the century after Westphalia, the colonies gradually moved from rigid theocratic models, such as Puritan Massachusetts, to more flexible systems that allowed dissent. Baptists, Quakers, and Lutherans slowly gained footholds. The idea that multiple faiths could coexist under a single political system, unthinkable in the early 1600s, became not just tolerated, but eventually protected. Still, the Peace of Westphalia did not bring peace to the colonies. Imperial rivalries intensified. Religious tensions persisted. Indigenous nations continued to face dispossession, disease, and war. But the logic of empire had changed. The colony was no longer an outpost of divine mandate. It was now a geopolitical asset, a node in a vast system of trade, territory, and power. By the time of the American Revolution in the late 18th century, many of the principles born in 1648, non-interference in internal affairs, sovereignty of the people, and balance of power diplomacy, had been adopted, adapted, and radicalized. When American revolutionaries rejected the divine right of kings, when they drafted secular constitutions, when they declared independence not in the name of God, but in the name of natural rights, they were, in some deep and indirect way, children of Westphalia. And yet, there is irony in the legacy. The Peace of Westphalia was never intended to birth liberty. It was designed to end exhaustion, to formalize toleration only enough to stop the bleeding. Its architects sought stability, not freedom. But in the hands of later generations, it became a foundation, one that allowed people to imagine a world beyond absolutism, beyond religious violence, beyond inherited power. In that sense, the fire that burned Europe from 1618 to 1648 was not just destructive. It was transformative. It consumed the old order and left behind the ashes from which modern states, and eventually modern revolutions, would rise. And across the Atlantic, in the forests of North America, a different kind of fire smoldered, not of war, but of ideas. Ideas that would soon challenge the empire itself. By the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, Europe was irrevocably changed. Cities once famed for learning and wealth lay in rubble. Monarchs reigned over fractured kingdoms. Faith, once the organizing principle of empires, had been caged behind treaties and borders. The Peace of Westphalia redrew the map, but beyond the lines inked in Europe, it also redrew the future of the New World. From the forests of Quebec to the swamps of Florida, the aftershocks of the war rippled outward. The Americas may not have hosted their battles, but they absorbed their consequences. What had begun as a theological quarrel in Bohemia helped forge the colonial order of the Atlantic world, shaping how Europeans governed, who they welcomed, what they feared, and ultimately, what they believed about themselves. This was the hidden legacy of the 30 Years' War in America. Not cannonballs and sieges, but systems and mindsets. Not crusades, but contracts. Not holy missions, but global empires. The colonial powers that emerged strongest from the war, France, England, and the Dutch Republic, did so not simply by winning battles, but by adapting. Spain, though still vast on paper, had entered a twilight of exhaustion. The war had drained its silver, exposed the brittleness of its empire, and left its North American holdings underpopulated, vulnerable, and culturally stagnant. Its colonies, once militant in faith, now limped forward on fumes. The French, by contrast, emerged from the war more centralized and more confident. Though their North American holdings remained sparsely populated, the Jesuits' missionary zeal, backed by the Crown, laid the groundwork for alliances and cultural infrastructure that would define New France. The vision of a Catholic empire in the Americas lived on, but now in a more strategic form. Missions tied to trade, conversions tied to diplomacy. The Dutch, newly recognized as an independent state by the Peace of Westphalia, brought the ruthless clarity of capitalism to the colonial project. New Netherland, carved into the coast with fur trade in mind, was not a city on a hill. It was a marketplace in a swamp. The Dutch used religious tolerance as a tool, not a virtue, welcoming Jews, dissenters, and traders of all stripes as long as the ledgers balanced. This model, though short-lived, profoundly influenced the urban and cultural DNA of what would become New York City. But it was England that would eventually gain the most from the war's aftermath. Though its early colonies were modest and frequently chaotic, torn between Puritan theocracy and mercantile ambition, England benefited from a key transformation sparked by the war: the rise of religious refugees and the decline of absolutist Catholic power in Europe. As German-speaking Protestants, French Huguenots, and Dutch Reformed families fled the scars of continental war, England's more flexible colonial framework, especially in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and the Carolinas, offered refuge. This influx did not merely populate towns, it transformed them. It brought with it pluralism, craftsmanship, and a memory of persecution that shaped political consciousness for generations. The trauma of war taught these immigrants the dangers of entangled church and state, of standing armies, of religious tyranny cloaked in law. And so they built quieter, more self-governing, more peace-driven communities. In time, those communities would become the breeding grounds of revolution. Meanwhile, the indigenous peoples of the Americas bore the silent cost of these transformations. As European empires emerged from the war more centralized and expansionist, colonial administrators intensified their grip on territory and trade. The balance between diplomacy and domination shifted. French alliances with the Huron and Algonquin, Dutch trade networks with the Mohawk, and Spanish mission systems in the Southwest all became more rigid, more extractive. European rivalries spilt into native politics, drawing tribes into conflicts shaped not by their own goals, but by the wars and treaties of distant kings. The Iroquois, empowered by Dutch arms and fueled by European demand for furs, waged the Beaver Wars across the Great Lakes, reshaping indigenous geopolitics. The Huron Confederacy, weakened by disease and Jesuit entanglements, collapsed under pressure. Native nations learned quickly. Survival in the post-Westphalian world required playing the empires against each other. Those who succeeded endured. Those who didn't disappeared. Even the landscape changed. European war had accelerated the extraction economy of silver in Spanish America, furs in the north, and tobacco in the south. These industries demanded labor, land, and logistics. Forests were cleared, rivers claimed, plantations spread. The logic of the modern state, born in the treaties of 1648, required measurement, taxation, and control. The New World was no longer merely a colony. It was an appendage of the state, a territory to be managed, mapped, and monetized. And yet, from this control also came resistance. The very ideas that Westphalia introduced, sovereignty, non-interference, pluralism, began to take root in the colonies in ways their European authors never intended. Colonial assemblies started asserting their rights. Merchants demanded free trade. Religious minorities claimed protection under natural law, not royal decree. Over time, the language of diplomacy, once reserved for kings, became the language of settlers. By the 1700s, a generation of colonial leaders, from Virginia planters to Philadelphia printers, had internalized a new political theology. That authority required consent, that faith and governance must be separate, and that sovereignty could reside not just in princes, but in the people. These were not accidents of geography or fate. They were the long echoes of war, of a war that taught Europe the cost of absolutism and taught the colonies the value of its alternatives. The New World, then, was not born of liberty alone. It was born of blood, not just spilt in American soil, but in the fields of Bohemia, the ruins of Magdeburg, and the alleys of Münster. It was shaped by ideas forged in desperation, that order was better than righteousness, that tolerance was safer than orthodoxy, that peace required boundaries. The 30 Years' War is often remembered as a European tragedy, a continental disaster, but its legacy stretched far beyond. It shaped the empire's map. It defined the principles of international law, and it planted the intellectual seeds that would one day bloom into revolutionary fire on the shores of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. In America, the war left no battlefields, but it left a blueprint drawn in blood.